Hi, my name is Liz Rivera, and we're here today to talk about trauma and how it relates to children in foster care. Now, specifically, we're going to talk about two kinds of trauma, and that is complex trauma and childhood trauma. We're going to start off talking about childhood trauma, but before I get there, I want to talk about the history of the diagnosis of PTSD. Now, we're going to start with a brain. This is a brain of a 19-year-old young man, born, raised in Kansas, has a mom and a dad and a dog and a tractor, baseball, friends. He's had a good life. And at 19, he decides to do something that a fewer percentage of our citizenry do today than at any point in our history, and that is he decides to join the military. Now, after multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, combat tours, he comes home and is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. Now, post-traumatic stress has an interesting history. Years ago, many years ago, a century ago, after the Civil War, World War II, World War III, heaven forbid we get there, World War II, it was called battle fatigue, shell shock. These were terms that people tended to use. It wasn't until our returning veterans from Vietnam that we started to really realize that there was a constellation of symptoms that seemed to be consistent across people. And that's where post-traumatic stress comes from. Now, PTSD is the official term, post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people today tend to drop the D. I do when I talk about it. I tend to simply refer to it as post-traumatic stress as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason why is I remember listening to a clinician on our local public radio station, and she said, when a returning veteran comes home and they're having symptoms of post-traumatic stress, she said, the last thing I want to do to them is convey the message that somehow they're broken. She says the first thing she says to them is, you are not broken and you don't need to be fixed. That your body has actually responded exactly the way it was designed to when it encountered an overwhelming traumatic situation. So a lot of clinicians today, they will say post-traumatic stress, but you don't hear post-traumatic stress disorder as much. And I like that and apply that to our kids too, though we don't want to think about them as broken or damaged. They have encountered traumatic events that have overwhelmed their capacity to cope, oftentimes because they're children. That is a normal response you would see. So I would say about a decade to 15 years ago, we started to get a little smarter in working with kids in foster care. And we started to say, I wonder if our kids are post-traumatic stress. And the answer, of course, is the vast majority of them are. And so they started to apply the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress to our kids. This was a huge advance because this is that trauma-informed shift that takes us from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. So it's an enormous shift. But the problem is we are using a diagnosis that really has to do with a pretty well-developed brain. Our brains don't fully develop until mid to late 20s. So this young man, his brain isn't fully developed, but pretty much is an adult brain. So we're talking about a traumatic event overlaid on an adult brain. A better description for our kids is that the trauma occurs during development, not after development. And so this visual representation would actually look more like this. So when I do this activity with a group in a class, I'll have some lovely, kind, well-meaning prospective foster parent in class, and I will give her this child's brain. And I will ask her, okay, now, fix them. Take the trauma out. Inevitably, what people do is they usually grin at me. Some of them will pick it up. They may try to take it out, but they give up very quickly. Some, most in fact, don't even try. And when I ask them, why didn't you even try? They will say, you can't do it. And I think we want to accept that. We can't. We cannot go back and change what has already happened to these kids. Our role in the system is after the fact. Unfortunately, it's not preventative, it's after the fact. So we need to understand that the traumatic events that our kids have experienced will always be a part of them. Now, what can we do then? One thing we can do is help the kids to start to understand their trauma, that they understand that maybe how they react to certain things is because of the trauma. So the example I want to use is about food, because it's a very common thing we see with our kids, and that's food hoarding. Some of our kids will hoard food by overeating, but much more common is kids who hoard food by hiding it in their closet and under their mattresses and in their backpacks, and food just goes missing from the kitchen. And what we usually tell people is to try to allow that with a boundary they're comfortable with. Some people's first instinct is to punish it or to limit it, but when they understand what this kid is reacting to is the traumatic event of not having enough to eat, which can be life-threatening. So it's very traumatic. So we tell them, not only do you provide food for the kids to hoard with a boundary you're comfortable with, but you also help them to understand why they want to do that. So we say something like, you know what, honey, the reason you want to hoard food is because your first mom and dad didn't know you needed to eat every day, so they didn't feed you enough. And so there's a part of your brain that's really, really scared that it's not going to get to eat again. And so that part of your brain tells you to hide food. So we're going to help you to do that so that part of your brain doesn't feel so scared. So the reason why this is really critical is if you just gave them food, that's great. It's going to help quiet that part. They're going to feel safer. That's wonderful. But the reason you actually want to tell them why they do this is that gives them a story that can live up here, that can help talk to the lower parts of the brain to quiet it. So when they're 25 years old and have a job at Target and it's their lunch break and no one is coming to let them go to lunch and they're hungry, their stomach's growling and they're getting angrier and angrier, they can say to themselves, okay, this is just that part of my brain that's freaking out because it thinks it's going to starve to death. I'm okay. I'm going to call my supervisor. I have food. I'm all right. So when you've told them that story over and over and over again, it allows them to understand and quiet those traumatic responses. And then, of course, you can teach them coping mechanisms, so calming things, breathing, mindfulness meditation. If they have a faith practice, things like meaningful prayer, all of these things can help quiet the traumatic response. So you're giving them understanding and knowledge as well as skills to live with this. Now, the other one we want to talk about is complex trauma. Now, this research fascinates me. This comes out of California, a large HMO there called Kaiser Permanente, and a man by the name of Vincent Felitti. Vincent Felitti was doing research in the 1980s with weight loss. It's just kind of really interesting that this research came out of weight loss. So he was working with people who were morbidly obese, meaning that they were, their lives were being threatened because they were so overweight. And they were put on a very strict diet, and over the course of a year to 2 years, they were losing enormous amounts of weight, 100, 200, sometimes 300 pounds. And so Dr. Felitti, he said he thought these people would be super excited because they were losing all this weight. And instead, they found anxiety increasing in these people, depression increasing, divorces, job losses, substance abuse increasing in this population. And they couldn't figure out why. So he started interviewing these people. And what he found is a significant portion, not all of them, but a significant portion of them had what they have now come to term adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And this is the fascinating research. So if I have one ACE, an adverse childhood experience, maybe one of my parents had a substance abuse disorder, maybe they were an alcoholic. That one ACE, adverse childhood experience, will go into my brain development and it will affect me, but the research would indicate it's not going to be that significant of an effect, even if it was years of dealing with it. As if it was the same kind of trauma over and over and over again, it turns out that doesn't overwhelm our capacity to cope. Now, if I add to that parental divorce, now I have an ACE score of 2. Things are a little harder now, and we do see risks start to go up with an ACE score of 2. And maybe there was also domestic violence because of the substance abuse and use. Now we have an ACE score of 3. Things are getting a little more difficult now. It's actually when we hit the ACE score of 4, so maybe we'll say in this case parental incarceration. Now with the ACE score of 4, that's when we seem to really lose our capacity to cope, because it's just too many things that require different responses from us, and we start to see increased symptomology. Now when I say symptomology, when we're thinking about children, we're thinking about the immediate effects we may see with our kids. But the research is fascinating in that they follow these people for decades. Heart disease, stroke, some types of cancer, substance abuse and misuse, all kinds of things increase dramatically with an ACE score of 4 or higher. And in fact, with an ACE score of 4 or higher, these people are actually more likely to die 20 years earlier than the rest of their cohort. So there are long-term effects of these traumatic events. Now this sounds pretty bleak, and this brain looks pretty bleak. So what can we do? What can we do more? So here's what we can do more, and this is from the Science of Resilience. The Science of Resilience tells us that even when bad things happen, if there are good things that come out of the bad or good things that help to balance the bad, people can be resilient. So what are we going to do with our kids? We're going to feed them. I mean, something as simple as making sure that they're eating nutritious food multiple times a day is powerful. Now, when I say nutritious food, one of the things from the ACE studies is that people who have high ACE scores tend to also have very poor diets. So lots of processed foods, lots of sugars, lots of processed fats. So we know that they struggle. So one of the ways we can intervene is not only feed them, but feed them with good food and teach them about good food. We can nurture them on a daily basis. So tucking them into bed, singing them songs, making up silly songs with their names in it, knowing them, paying attention to them, listening to them, all those nurturing acts are going to become a part of our child's experience. We can make sure they have good experiences with peers. What the research shows is that parental figures are incredibly important. Peers are also as important, and in fact, in adolescence, probably become almost as important as parents. So we increase their likelihood of having good peer relationships and skill with that. We make sure they're getting a good education, and that's formal and informal. So that's help with school, good teachers, good schools. It's also informal education, the zoo, the aquarium, the museums, that the more kids are exposed to those things, the stronger they can become, the more resilient they become. We give them opportunities to serve. So many times our kids are kind of the product of being served. They're, oh, these poor little kids. When I want to teach my kid, you have the power to make the world better. You can help other people. There are always other people who can use your assistance, and you can help them. So we give them opportunities to serve. And we help them to develop their personalities. We accept them for who they are, and we honor and respect them. So now what we end up with is a brain that looks like probably a lot of our brains. We have some stuff in there that we wish weren't in there. There's experiences we've had, some of which have been difficult, some of which may have been traumatic. Those things remain a part of us. But guess what? The good stuff also remains a part of us. Just like I try to give that brain to the foster mom and tell her to take out the trauma, she can't. If I gave this to her and said, take out the good stuff, she can't do that either. The good stuff remains. And the Science of Resilience tells us that what creates a resilient person is opportunity to understand their trauma, to develop skill to deal with it, and positive input that helps to counteract and outweigh the difficult things in their life. Now, there's also an entire field of post-traumatic growth that we've been talking about post-traumatic stress, but there's a lot of research right now on how people are actually stronger, more insightful, more resilient after trauma. And that happens when they get the support that they need. And that's our goal with foster care, is to provide children the supports that they need that will help them to move on from their traumatic events and have the most successful life they can. Thank you.